Columbus died thinking he found Asia. Franklin packed 8,000 cans of food, sealed with poison, and one guy accidentally walked across an entire continent just looking for lunch. These are the 111 dumbest mistakes by the most famous explorers in history. And number 47 will make you question everything you learned in school. Hit that hype button right now, because you are not ready for how stupid this gets. Let's go. 1. Columbus was so sure he had reached Asia that he sailed all the way to the Bahamas and called it a day. He met the Taino people, looked around at the tropical islands, and genuinely thought he was somewhere near India or China. He was off by literally an entire planet's worth of geography. The man died in 1506, still insisting he had reached the East Indies. 2 continents were sitting right there, and he never once admitted he found them. 2. Vasco da Gama was on his way to India in 1498, opening up a trade route for Portugal, which sounds perfectly reasonable, until you hear what he did along the way. He came across a ship carrying 400 Muslim pilgrims, locked every single door from the outside, and set the whole thing on fire. Then he sailed off toward India like absolutely nothing had happened. History books call this a voyage of discovery. Others might use different words entirely. 3. Ferdinand Magellan spent years planning the first circumnavigation of the entire globe, which is genuinely impressive until you learn he never actually finished it. In 1521, he sailed all the way to the Philippines, got himself tangled up in a completely local political dispute between 2 rival chiefs that had absolutely nothing to do with his mission, and decided to join one side in battle. A man who had survived oceans and storms got killed on a beach in a fight that was never his to begin with. His own crew finished without him. 4. Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519 with 600 men and immediately made a decision so extreme that historians still argue about it today. He burned all 11 of his own ships right there on the shore so that nobody could sail back home even if they wanted to. No boats meant no retreat and no second thoughts. His men were now fully committed whether they liked it or not. Military historians call it bold strategy. The 600 men standing on that beach watching their only way home turned to ash probably had other words for it. 5. Francisco de Orellana was supposed to go find food for his starving expedition somewhere in the South American jungle in 1542 and come straight back. He paddled away from camp, hit the current of a massive river, and just kept going. 3,000 miles later, he had accidentally traveled the entire length of the Amazon River and ended up on the Atlantic coast. He never went back for his crew. He told everyone in Spain it was a great adventure and discovery. The men he left behind in the jungle likely had a completely different opinion. 6. John Franklin packed everything he possibly could for his 1845 Arctic expedition, including 8,000 cans of food, which sounds very responsible until you find out the cans were sealed with lead solder. His crew of 129 men slowly consumed lead poisoning along with every meal they ate out in the freezing Arctic. Researchers who later examined the bodies found extraordinary levels of lead in their bones and hair. Every single man on that expedition died. Franklin had prepared carefully for everything except the actual food that was supposed to keep them alive. 7. Robert Falcon Scott decided to use Siberian ponies to haul his supplies across Antarctica in 1911 instead of sled dogs, which would have been the obvious choice given that dogs had been working in polar conditions for centuries. The ponies sank into the snow, struggled in the cold, and were essentially useless. Meanwhile, Roald Amundsen was racing toward the same destination using sled dogs like a person who had done basic research. Amundsen beat Scott to the South Pole by 33 days. Scott and his men all died on the return trip. The ponies had also died well before that. 8. Ernest Shackleton gathered 28 men for a grand Antarctic expedition in 1914, and their ship the Endurance got completely crushed by pack ice before the actual expedition even officially began. The men never even set foot on the continent they came to cross. Instead, they camped on drifting ice for months, watched their ship sink, dragged lifeboats across frozen ocean, and eventually sailed 800 miles through the most violent seas on Earth in an open boat to find help. Shackleton got all 28 men out alive, which is miraculous. But the original mission was a total disaster from day one. 9. Meriwether Lewis managed to lead one of the most celebrated expeditions in American history across thousands of miles of completely uncharted wilderness, and survived every single dangerous moment of it, only to shoot himself in the backside on the return trip. It happened during a routine hunting stop in 1806, when his companion mistook him for an elk and fired. Lewis spent the next several days traveling by boat, lying face down in tremendous pain. The journals record the incident with remarkable calm, considering one of America's greatest explorers had just been accidentally shot in the rear end by his own team. 10. William Clark was the co-leader of the most important overland expedition in American history, a man trusted by President Jefferson to document everything they encountered with precision and care. Across the journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition, Clark spelled the word Sioux 27 different ways. 27. In the same journals. Attempts included Sioux, Sioux, and Sioux, among others. Nobody corrected him. The journals were published and those spellings went into the historical record. Clark mapped rivers, documented wildlife, negotiated with nations, and somehow never once landed on the same spelling of one single word twice. 11. Hernando de Soto spent 4 years wandering through the American Southeast in the 1540s with a massive army, convinced he was about to find mountains of gold any day now. He marched through what is today Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi, finding absolutely zero gold at every single stop. He eventually collapsed and died of fever right on the banks of the Mississippi River, broke and defeated. His men were so scared the local tribes would attack if they found out their powerful leader was dead, that they secretly sank his body in the river in the middle of the night. 12. Marco Polo claimed he spent 17 years in China during the 1200s, met Kublai Khan personally, and traveled across the most fascinating civilization on Earth. His book became one of the most famous travel accounts in history. There is just one small problem. His detailed journals never once mentioned chopsticks, tea, foot binding, or the Great Wall of China. These were not minor details. These were things that defined daily life for literally everyone living there. Historians have been arguing ever since about whether Marco Polo actually went to China at all, or just collected second-hand stories from merchants along the Silk Road. 13. Giovanni da Verrazzano sailed along the North American coast in 1524 on behalf of the King of France looking for a passage to the Pacific Ocean. He reached the outer banks of North Carolina, spotted a large body of shimmering water behind a thin strip of land, and immediately wrote back to the king, announcing he had found the Pacific Ocean. He had found a lagoon, a shallow coastal lagoon sitting behind a sandbar. He marked it on the map as the Pacific anyway. European cartographers copied that mistake onto their own maps, and it stayed there for years before anyone bothered to check. 14. Henry Hudson spent years sailing for various employers trying to find a northern route to Asia, and never quite succeeded, which was frustrating enough. In 1611, his crew finally had enough of his leadership style during a brutal Canadian winter and staged a full mutiny. They grabbed Hudson, his teenage son, and 7 sick crewmen, shoved them all into a small open boat, and set them adrift in the freezing bay that now bears Hudson's name. The mutineers sailed home to England. Hudson was never seen again. The mutineers faced a brief investigation and faced almost no serious punishment whatsoever. 15. Walter Raleigh had already been thrown in the Tower of London by King James I when he came up with his pitch to get out. He told the king he knew exactly where El Dorado was, the legendary golden city in South America, and that he could go find it and bring back enough gold to make everyone rich. The king let him out. Raleigh sailed to South America in 1617, found absolutely nothing, and came back empty-handed. The King of England was not impressed. Raleigh was sent straight back to the Tower of London and executed shortly after. 16. 2 entire continents received the name America, not because Amerigo Vespucci discovered them first, but largely because he wrote better marketing material. Columbus arrived in the New World before Vespucci and never properly announced what he had found. Vespucci wrote vivid, widely circulated letters describing a brand new continent that had nothing to do with Asia. A German cartographer named Waldseemüller read those letters in 1507 and decided to name the new landmass after Amerigo. Columbus got the discovery, and Vespucci got his name on 2 continents. It remains one of the greatest branding victories in the history of geography. 17. James Cook successfully navigated the entire Pacific Ocean, charted coastlines that no European had ever seen, and survived encounters with rough seas and unknown territories across multiple voyages. Then, in 1779, he sailed back to Hawaii for a second visit, and things went sideways over a stolen rowboat. A small boat went missing from his ship. Cook went ashore to personally confront the Hawaiian chief about it. The situation escalated rapidly, a scuffle broke out on the beach, and Cook was killed. The man who conquered the Pacific Ocean died in an argument over a rowboat that he himself had inflamed. 18. Alvar Núñez. Cabeza de Vaca left Florida in 1528 as part of a 600-man expedition, and almost immediately everything collapsed. Ships were lost, men died, and the survivors built rafts and tried to sail along the Gulf Coast. More men died. Cabeza de Vaca and a tiny group of survivors washed ashore in Texas, were captured, traveled from tribe to tribe across the continent, and spent 8 years wandering across North America with no map and no plan. They eventually stumbled into Mexico City, having accidentally crossed the entire continent on foot. Nobody had planned any part of that journey. 19. Juan Ponce de León convinced the Spanish crown to fund an expedition to Florida in 1521, based largely on his interest in finding a mythical fountain whose waters could restore youth and cure aging. He arrived in Florida with 200 men, set up camp, and was almost immediately met with fierce resistance from the Calusa people. During the fighting, Ponce de León was struck by a poisoned arrow. The expedition abandoned Florida entirely and sailed to Cuba, where Ponce de León died from the wound shortly after. He never found the fountain. He also never found anything else useful on that particular trip. 20. Zebulon Pike looked up at the enormous Colorado Peak that now bears his name in 1806 and declared after one failed attempt that it was completely unclimbable and no human being would ever reach the top. He wrote this assessment officially into his expedition report with full confidence. The mountain is today one of the most visited summits in the entire United States. Tourists reach the top by car, by cog railway, by bicycle, and on foot in running shoes. More than 300,000 people visit the summit every single year. Pike never made it. He also never revised his opinion. 21. John Charles Fremont was warned repeatedly by experienced guides and local mountain men not to attempt crossing the San Juan Mountains of Colorado in the middle of winter in 1848. He ignored every single warning, pushed his expedition into deep snow at high altitude anyway, and the situation collapsed catastrophically within weeks. The party became stranded, supplies ran out, and the men began dying. Those who survived resorted to cannibalism to make it out alive. Fremont himself survived, reorganized at a lower elevation, and then attempted a different mountain crossing that same winter. He had learned absolutely nothing from any of it. 22. The Donner Party made a decision in 1846 that started with a book. A man named Lansford Hastings had written a popular trail guide promoting a brand new shortcut through the Sierra Nevada called the Hastings Cutoff that he promised would save travelers significant time. The Donner Party followed his advice enthusiastically. The shortcut added 3 brutal weeks to their journey, exhausted their animals, and delayed them just long enough to get trapped by early winter snowfall in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The most devastating detail is that Lansford Hastings had never actually traveled the route himself when he wrote the guide recommending it. 23. Robert O'Hara Burke led the first European attempt to cross Australia from south to north in 1861, which was genuinely ambitious and genuinely disastrous in equal measure. He made a desperate final push to the northern coast with a small group, turned around, and raced back to their supply depot at Cooper Creek, where food and backup were waiting. He arrived back at the depot just hours after the resupply party had given up waiting and left. The rescue team had waited for months. Burke missed them by a matter of hours. He died of starvation at that exact spot shortly after. 24. Henry Morton Stanley was sent to Africa in 1871 by a New York newspaper to find the explorer David Livingstone, which immediately raises the question of why Livingstone needed finding. Livingstone was not lost. He was not in danger. He was a grown man doing fieldwork in Africa who had not asked anyone to come looking for him. Stanley tracked him down at a lakeside village, greeted him with the now famous line, and wrote a best-selling book about the dramatic rescue. Livingstone refused to leave with Stanley and stayed in Africa until his death 2 years later, entirely on his own terms. 25. Percy Fawcett was a British explorer who became completely obsessed with finding a lost ancient civilization somewhere in the Amazon rainforest that he called the City of Z. In 1925, he walked into the jungle in Brazil with his son and a friend and was never seen again. No confirmed remains were ever recovered. No definitive explanation was ever established. What happened next is somehow even more remarkable. Over 100 people have since died on expeditions attempting to find out what happened to Fawcett. The man vanished looking for a lost city, and then became a lost person that others died trying to find. 26. Gaspar Corte-Real sailed to Newfoundland in 1501 and disappeared without leaving any trace behind. His brother Miguel organized a search expedition and sailed to find him, and also disappeared completely. A third brother then requested permission from the King of Portugal to sail out and search for both of his missing brothers. The King of Portugal looked at the situation, considered that 2 ships and 2 brothers had already vanished on this exact mission, and flatly refused to authorize a third expedition. It was probably the most sensible decision made by anyone connected to this family during this entire period. 27. Vitus Bering is famous for discovering the strait between Asia and North America that now carries his name, which was a genuinely significant achievement in the history of exploration. Then he went on another voyage. In 1741, Bering became stranded on a completely uninhabited island in the Pacific after his ship was wrecked during a storm on the return journey. He developed scurvy, became too weak to move, and died on that island. The island is today called Bering Island. The man who mapped one of the most important geographical features on Earth died stranded and sick on a frozen rock named after him. 28. John Cabot sailed from England in 1497 and successfully reached North America, becoming one of the first Europeans to set foot on the continent after Columbus. England was thrilled. The king gave him money and sent him back out with 5 ships in 1498 for a follow-up expedition to build on that success. John Cabot sailed away with 5 ships and was never heard from again. Not one of the 5 ships returned. Not a single crew member came back with any information. No wreckage was conclusively identified. One of the most significant explorers in English history simply vanished on his second voyage. 29. Roald Amundsen was the greatest polar explorer who ever lived by almost any measure. He led the first expedition to successfully reach the South Pole, completed the first navigation of the Northwest Passage, and survived conditions that killed nearly everyone else who attempted the same things. Then, in 1928, another explorer named Umberto Nobile crashed an airship in the Arctic, and Amundsen volunteered for the search and rescue mission. The plane he was flying disappeared over the Arctic Ocean. They found a pontoon and some wreckage, but never found Amundsen. The most successful polar explorer in history died on a rescue mission in the ice. 30. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado marched 300 Spanish soldiers across the entire American Southwest for 2 full years between 1540 and 1542, chasing persistent rumors of 7 magnificent cities built entirely of gold, called the 7 Cities of Cibola. He crossed deserts, rivers, and plains and reached the cities. They were ordinary adobe pueblos built from mud and straw. There was no gold anywhere. Coronado returned to Mexico City empty-handed, deeply in debt, and was promptly put on trial for mismanaging the expedition and for cruelty toward indigenous people along the way. The Golden Cities were never found because they never existed. 31. Álvaro de Mendaña discovered the Solomon Islands in the Pacific in 1568 and was so excited about the find that he spent the next 26 years trying to sail back to them for a colonization mission. He finally organized an expedition in 1595 with 378 settlers ready to build a new colony. He arrived 300 miles off from the actual Solomon Islands, landed on the wrong islands entirely. His settlers started dying of disease immediately, and Mendaña himself died shortly after arrival. His wife took command of the surviving colonists. The colony collapsed entirely. He had spent 26 years planning a trip to the wrong place. 32. Willem Barents was a Dutch navigator who made 3 separate attempts to find a northeast passage to Asia by sailing north of Russia, which was ambitious considering nobody had any idea what was up there. On his 3rd voyage in 1596, his ship got completely frozen into Arctic ice off the coast of Novaya Zemlya and could not move in any direction. Barents and his crew dismantled parts of the ship and built a wooden hut on the ice and spent an entire Arctic winter inside it, surviving temperatures that should have killed all of them. He survived the winter but died on the return journey home just before reaching safety. 33. George Bass was a British naval surgeon who became an explorer, almost by accident, helping to chart significant portions of the Australian coastline, and proving that Tasmania was an island separate from the mainland. He was celebrated in Britain and Australia for these achievements. Then, in 1803, he loaded a ship with trading goods, sailed to South America on a commercial voyage, and completely vanished. No wreckage was found, no survivors appeared, no distress signals reached anyone, no explanation was ever confirmed. A man who had survived charting the wild Australian coast in a tiny boat simply disappeared on a routine trading trip, and nobody ever found out why. 34. Matthew Flinders became the first person to successfully circumnavigate the entire continent of Australia, completing one of the great feats of maritime exploration in history. On his way back to England in 1803, he stopped at the French-controlled island of Mauritius to make repairs to his ship. Despite the fact that France and Britain were actively at war with each other at the time, Flinders assumed his scientific mission gave him diplomatic protection. The French governor did not agree. Flinders was detained on suspicion of spying and held on that island for 6.5 years before finally being released and allowed to go home. 35. Jean-François de Galaup, known as La Pérouse, set out in 1785 on a French scientific expedition around the Pacific that was considered one of the most sophisticated voyages of exploration ever organized. The expedition vanished in 1788, and nobody knew what had happened for nearly 4 decades. When the wreck was finally discovered in 1826 on a reef near the Solomon Islands, investigators made a detail that made the whole thing worse. The reef the ships had sailed into was clearly marked on the navigational charts that La Pérouse himself had been carrying on board. He sailed directly into a reef that was already on his map. 36. Gonzalo Pizarro led an expedition into the Amazon jungle in 1541 with a very specific shopping list. He was looking for cinnamon trees, which were enormously valuable spice trade commodities, and also for El Dorado, the legendary city of gold, because why not aim high? He found neither. What he did find was impenetrable jungle, disease, starvation, and disaster. He lost over 4,000 indigenous allies and most of his Spanish soldiers along the way. He eventually emerged from the jungle after 2 years with a fraction of his original force. No cinnamon, no gold, and nothing whatsoever to show for the entire catastrophic undertaking. 37. Diego de Almagro decided in 1535 that Chile was worth conquering and marched his entire army over the Andes Mountains to go get it. Crossing the Andes in winter meant brutal altitude, freezing temperatures, and almost no food. Hundreds of his men died from frostbite, altitude sickness, and exhaustion just getting there. He finally reached Chile after losing enormous numbers of men and supplies on the crossing. Chile turned out to contain nothing of obvious value to Spanish conquistadors at the time. Almagro then turned his entire army around and marched them all back over the same Andes Mountains again through the same brutal conditions. 38. Samuel Hearne set off on foot from a Hudson Bay Company outpost in 1769 to find a fabled copper mine that indigenous informants had described somewhere in the Canadian Arctic. His first attempt failed completely when his supplies were stolen. His second attempt also failed when his equipment broke down in the cold. He tried a third time in 1770 with better planning and finally made it to the site after an extraordinary overland journey. The copper mine that had driven 3 expeditions and years of effort turned out to be a small scattered deposit of copper pieces on a riverbed, with almost no commercial value whatsoever. 39. Alexander Mackenzie set out in 1789 to canoe down a massive Canadian river that he was convinced would lead him west to the Pacific Ocean and open up a transcontinental trade route. He paddled for weeks through increasingly cold and remote territory, following the river faithfully as it bent and turned through the wilderness. The river did not go to the Pacific Ocean. It went north. It led directly to the Arctic Ocean, which is essentially the opposite of where he wanted to go. Mackenzie was so thoroughly disappointed by this outcome that he named the River of Disappointment. It is now called the Mackenzie River, named after him. 40. John Ledyard was an American adventurer who proposed one of the most spectacularly impractical travel plans in exploration history. In 1786, he convinced himself he could walk across the entire continent of Siberia, cross the Bering Strait into Alaska, and then walk across all of North America from west to east completely alone and on foot. Thomas Jefferson thought this sounded reasonable and encouraged him. Ledyard actually made it into Siberia before Catherine the Great had him arrested on suspicion of being a spy and deported back to the Polish border. His solo walk across 2 continents ended before he reached the first ocean. 41. John Byron was a British naval commander whose nickname was Foul Weather Jack, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how his career went. In 1764, he was given a ship and sent to find the Northwest Passage, one of the most sought-after geographical prizes in exploration history. Byron sailed in entirely the wrong direction, ended up in the Pacific Ocean, and spent his voyage discovering islands that were interesting but completely irrelevant to his actual mission. He returned to England having found no passage and having gone nowhere near where he was supposed to look. His entire career was defined by extraordinary bad luck and questionable navigation in equal measure. 42. James Weddell was a Scottish seal hunter who accidentally became one of the greatest Antarctic explorers in history during a voyage in 1823. He sailed deeper into Antarctic waters than any human being had ever gone, reaching a latitude of 74 degrees 15 minutes south in a sea that was remarkably clear and free of ice, which was almost unheard of in that region. Then he turned around and went home. He had no particular reason to push further, and sealing was his actual business. The extraordinary open water conditions he encountered that day did not return for another 80 years. Nobody sailed as far south again for nearly a century. 43. John Ross sailed into the Arctic in 1829 with a steamship called the Victory, which was supposed to represent the cutting edge of modern naval technology and give his expedition a decisive advantage over the ice. The steam engine broke down almost immediately and was essentially useless for the entire voyage. Ross then got his ship frozen solid in Arctic ice where it stayed, completely immovable, for 4 consecutive years. The ship was eventually so damaged and so deeply embedded that Ross had no choice but to abandon it entirely. He and his crew then walked across the ice to safety and were eventually rescued by a passing whaling ship. 44. Edward Belcher was sent by the Royal Navy in 1852 with 5 ships and a large crew to search the Arctic for any sign of the lost Franklin expedition, which had disappeared years earlier. This rescue mission went wrong in a way that is almost impressive. Belcher managed to get 4 of his 5 ships trapped in Arctic ice simultaneously. He then made the controversial decision to abandon all 4 vessels and march his men across the ice to safety. He returned to England having found no trace of Franklin and having lost 4 Navy ships in the process. He was court-martialed and was acquitted only because nobody could agree on what the correct decision should have been. 45. Charles Wilkes commanded a major United States exploring expedition from 1838 to 1842 that covered enormous distances across the Pacific and Antarctic regions. He returned, claiming to have personally charted 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline, which would have been a tremendous scientific achievement. Significant portions of his charts turned out to be wrong. He had also spent the voyage court-martialing so many of his own officers for various offenses that the situation became a running scandal. When he got back to America, he was himself court-martialed for his conduct during the expedition. He was convicted on 1 charge and received a public reprimand, which given everything was a remarkably light outcome. 46. Jules Dumont d'Urville was a French naval officer who raced to Antarctica in 1838 specifically to plant a French flag on the continent before anyone else could get there. He succeeded, which was genuinely exciting for France. He named the territory Adelie Land after his wife, collected some penguin specimens, and celebrated the achievement with his crew. Then, on the voyage back toward Australia, his ship sailed directly into an iceberg and crashed. The ship survived, but the collision caused serious damage and was an embarrassing conclusion to an otherwise triumphant mission. D'Urville had navigated all the way to Antarctica and back, and then hit something enormous on the easy part of the journey. 47. George Vancouver spent 4 extraordinarily careful years, between 1791 and 1795, charting the Pacific Northwest coastline of North America in meticulous detail. His surveys were so precise and so thorough that sailors and navigators used his charts for almost 100 years after he made them. The work was genuinely remarkable by any standard of the era. There is, however, one notable gap in an otherwise impressive record. Vancouver sailed completely past the mouth of the Columbia River without noticing it was there. The Columbia River is one of the largest rivers in North America. He missed it entirely, sailing right past the entrance while carefully documenting everything else around it. 48. Richard Francis Burton and John Hanning Speke were sent together to find the source of the Nile in 1858, which sounds like the beginning of a productive partnership. It was not. The two men developed an intense mutual dislike during the expedition that grew into a bitter public feud lasting years. Speke correctly identified Lake Victoria as the source of the Nile, but Burton publicly disputed this finding and argued against it despite the evidence. The disagreement consumed both men's reputations and energy for years. They were scheduled to publicly debate the question in 1864, and Speke died the day before the debate from a gunshot wound, ending the argument without resolution. 49. John Hanning Speke made the correct call of the century when he identified Lake Victoria as the source of the Nile, one of the longest-standing geographical mysteries in history. The problem was that he could not immediately prove it with the kind of hard measurements that would satisfy the scientific establishment back in London. His former partner Burton attacked the claim publicly and loudly. The debate grew into a national spectacle in Britain. A formal public debate was arranged for September 1864 to settle the matter once and for all. Speke died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound the morning of the day the debate was scheduled, taking the drama to a level nobody had anticipated. 50. David Livingstone spent the final 7 years of his life wandering through Central Africa, convinced he was closing in on the source of the Nile, one of geography's greatest unsolved questions. He walked enormous distances through difficult territory, sick and increasingly frail, following river systems and documenting everything he encountered. The problem was that he was following entirely the wrong river system the entire time. He was tracing tributaries of the Congo River, which flows to the Atlantic Ocean, not the Nile, which flows north to the Mediterranean. He died in 1873 still searching, still convinced he was right, pointed in completely the wrong direction for 7 consecutive years. 51. Heinrich Barth spent 5 years crossing the Sahara and Central Africa between 1850 and 1855, surviving extraordinary dangers and documenting everything he encountered with obsessive scientific precision. He returned to Europe with a report spanning 3,500 pages of detailed observations, maps, and cultural records. Nobody read it. The report was so dense and exhaustive that the general public ignored it completely, and the academic world barely engaged with it. Barth had risked his life for 5 years producing work that sat largely unread for decades. He died frustrated and largely uncelebrated. 52. Mungo Park sailed down the Niger River on his second expedition in 1805, determined to trace it to its mouth no matter what. His approach to local communities along the riverbanks was aggressively hostile, refusing to stop and engage peacefully with anyone. This strategy made enemies of virtually every group he encountered along the way. His canoe was eventually attacked at the Bussa Rapids by people who had every reason to be suspicious of him. Park drowned attempting to swim away from the attack. His obsessive refusal to simply be diplomatic on a river surrounded by people cost him his life. 53. René Robert Cavelier de la Salle claimed the entire Mississippi River basin for France in 1682 and then set out to establish a colony at the river's mouth from the Gulf of Mexico side. He overshot the Mississippi River Delta by 400 miles and landed in Texas instead. He wandered coastal Texas for 2 years with a dwindling and increasingly miserable group of colonists trying to find the river he was looking for. His own men eventually had enough. They ambushed and murdered him somewhere in eastern Texas in 1687. He never found the Mississippi from the other side. 54. Louis-Antoine de Bougainville completed a full circumnavigation of the globe between 1766 and 1769 and brought along a botanist's assistant named Jean Barré to help catalog plant specimens. Jean Barré was actually a woman named Jeanne Barré disguised as a man, making her the first woman to circumnavigate the globe. Bougainville apparently did not notice for a considerable portion of the voyage. She had applied for the job presenting herself as a man because women were prohibited from French naval vessels. She completed the entire journey, and history barely remembered her name for 2 centuries afterward. 55. Nikolai Przewalski made 4 major expeditions into Central Asia and Tibet during the 1870s and 1880s, each time pushing toward the forbidden city of Lhasa, and each time failing to reach it. He became one of the most celebrated explorers in Russia, despite never quite achieving his main goal. On his 5th attempt in 1888, he stopped to drink water from a river without filtering it first. He contracted typhoid fever almost immediately and died before his expedition had even properly entered Tibetan territory. 4 expeditions of extraordinary difficulty, and he was stopped on the 5th by unfiltered river water. 56. Richard Byrd claimed in 1926 to have flown over the North Pole, becoming an instant American hero who received a ticker tape parade in New York and the Medal of Honor from Congress. Decades later, his own personal diary from the flight was discovered by researchers. The diary entries suggested his plane had actually turned back approximately 150 miles short of the North Pole due to an oil leak, and that he had falsified his navigation records to claim success anyway. Byrd never addressed the discrepancy publicly. The ticker tape parade had already happened and the medal was already on his wall. 57. Robert Peary planted an American flag at what he claimed was the exact North Pole in 1909 and returned to a hero's welcome in the United States. The problem was that his claimed travel speeds during the final push toward the pole were so extraordinarily fast that modern researchers who have analyzed his records consider them physically implausible given the conditions. His navigation methods also made precise verification nearly impossible. Whether Peary actually reached the pole remains genuinely disputed by serious researchers more than a century later. He received full credit anyway and is still officially listed as first to the North Pole. 58. Frederick Cook claimed he had reached the North Pole in 1908, a full year before Peary made the same claim, setting off one of the most bitter priority disputes in exploration history. Cook's evidence was examined and found deeply unconvincing by most experts. His case was not helped when he was later convicted of mail fraud in a completely separate oil stock scheme that had nothing to do with the Arctic. Being a convicted fraudster while simultaneously claiming a disputed geographical record is not an ideal combination for credibility. Almost nobody accepted his North Pole claim then, and almost nobody accepts it now. 59. William Parry set out in 1827 to reach the North Pole by dragging sledges across the Arctic ice, which was already an extremely ambitious plan. He discovered a problem after beginning the journey that nobody had fully anticipated. The Arctic ice pack was drifting southward faster than he and his men could physically walk northward across it. He was essentially on a treadmill moving in the wrong direction. No matter how hard they marched toward the pole, the ice carried them back faster than they advanced. He eventually turned around, having made almost no real progress northward, despite weeks of exhausting effort. 60. Robert McClure sailed into the Arctic from the Pacific side in 1850, searching for the Northwest Passage, and became completely trapped in the ice near Banks Island. He and his crew spent 3 winters stuck there, slowly running out of food and supplies. A rescue party eventually reached them by sledge from another icebound ship. McClure and his crew walked out across the ice and then sailed home on the rescue vessel. He claimed the honor of completing the Northwest Passage, even though he had walked a significant portion of it and been rescued in the middle. Parliament awarded him the prize money anyway. 61. Otto von Kotzebue was a Russian naval officer sent in 1815 to find the Northwest Passage by approaching from the Pacific side. He sailed north along the Alaskan coast and discovered a large, promising inlet that appeared to open up into a vast interior waterway. Kotzebue was convinced he had found the entrance to the legendary passage and reported this exciting discovery back to his superiors. He had found a bay, a perfectly ordinary bay with no connection to anything on the other side. It is today called Kotzebue Sound, and it goes nowhere significant. The Northwest Passage remained unfound. 62. Semyon Desnev was a Russian Cossack explorer who actually sailed through the strait separating Asia from North America in 1648, proving the two continents were not connected. This was a genuinely world-changing geographical discovery that should have immediately reshaped how Europeans understood the planet. His report was filed in a regional archive in Siberia and sat there completely unread for 80 years. Vitus Bering then sailed through the same strait in 1728 and received full credit for the discovery because nobody had bothered to check the archives. Desnev had done it first and received almost nothing for it. 63. Francisco de Ulloa sailed the entire length of the Baja California Peninsula in 1539 and proved beyond any reasonable doubt that it was a peninsula attached to the mainland and not a separate island. He documented this clearly and reported back to his superiors. Spanish cartographers subsequently ignored his findings completely and continued drawing California as a large island on their maps. This mistake was copied and repeated by mapmakers across Europe for over 100 years. California appeared as an island on official maps well into the 1700s, despite Ulloa having proven otherwise more than a century and a half earlier. 64. Juan de Fuca was a Greek navigator sailing for Spain who claimed in 1592 to have discovered the Northwest Passage and sailed through it for 20 days, describing broad inland waters and rich lands beyond. This sounded extraordinary and potentially very valuable. Most historians today believe the account was either largely fictional or a massive exaggeration of what was actually a relatively straightforward coastal sailing experience. The strait in the Pacific Northwest that now bears his name does exist and is genuinely significant, but it is emphatically not the Northwest Passage he claimed to have sailed through for 20 days. 65. Sebastian Vizcaíno was sent to re-explore the California coast in 1602, a coast that the explorer Cabrillo had already carefully charted and named 60 years earlier. Vizcaíno sailed the same coastline and simply renamed everything. Every bay, every point, every inlet that Cabrillo had already documented and named received a completely new name from Vizcaíno. He submitted his new names as if the previous exploration had never happened. Spanish authorities accepted his version. Cabrillo's original place names were wiped from the maps entirely. This created significant cartographic confusion that navigators and mapmakers had to untangle for the next 150 years. 66. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo became the first European to explore the California coast in 1542, which was a significant achievement that earned him a permanent place in the history books. He did not survive the expedition. At some point during the voyage, he fell while scrambling ashore to help his crew during a skirmish and broke a limb. The injury became severely infected. Cabrillo died from the infection while still on the expedition. His crew continued the voyage without him and kept exploring the coast northward. The first European explorer of California died from a fall during his own expedition, and his place names were later erased by Vizcaíno anyway. 67. Gaspar de Portola was sent north from Mexico by land in 1769 with very specific instructions to locate Monterey Bay in California and establish a settlement there. He arrived at Monterey Bay and did not recognize it. The written description he had been given was vague and inaccurate enough that the actual bay did not match what he was expecting to find. He concluded it must be somewhere further north and kept walking. He eventually stumbled upon an enormous bay that nobody from his expedition had ever seen before. He had accidentally discovered San Francisco Bay while looking for a completely different bay he had already passed. 68. George Anson left England in 1740 with 6 ships and nearly 2,000 men on a mission to circumnavigate the globe and raid Spanish ports along the way. He returned 4 years later with 1 ship and around 500 men. The majority of deaths came not from enemy action or storms, but from scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. The cure for scurvy, which involves citrus fruit, was already known to many physicians and sailors at the time of departure. Anson lost over 1,400 men largely to a preventable disease whose solution was sitting in every orange in every port they passed. 69. Bartholomew Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa in 1488, becoming the first European to accomplish this and open up the possibility of a sea route to India. His crew was so frightened by the storms and the unknown waters that they refused to go any further and forced him to turn back. Dias named the cape they had rounded the Cape of Storms, which was an accurate description of what they had experienced there. The King of Portugal heard this name and immediately changed it to the Cape of Good Hope, because Cape of Storms was terrible for encouraging future expeditions and investors. 70. Pedro Álvares Cabral was given command of a Portuguese fleet in 1500 and sent to India by sailing around the southern tip of Africa. To catch favorable trade winds in the Atlantic, he swung his fleet far out to the west, which was standard navigational practice at the time. He swung so far west that he made landfall on a coastline that was not Africa. It was South America. Cabral had accidentally discovered Brazil while trying to sail to India. He spent a few days there, claimed the land for Portugal, sent 1 ship back to Lisbon with the news, and then continued sailing east toward India as originally planned. 71. Juan Díaz de Solís discovered the massive Rio de la Plata estuary in South America in 1516 and announced confidently that he had found a route straight through to Asia. He was wrong about that, but the discovery was still significant. He went ashore with a small party to make contact with the local Charrua people, while his remaining crew watched from the ships. The Charrua killed the entire landing party immediately and reportedly ate them within full view of the crew still sitting on the boats offshore. The horrified sailors could do nothing but watch and then sail back to Spain without their captain. 72. Antonio de Abreu led a Portuguese expedition in 1511 and reached the Spice Islands known as the Moluccas, which was the single most commercially valuable destination in the entire world at that moment in history. Every major European power was desperately trying to find a direct route there. Abreu found them, documented the location, loaded up spices, and sailed home. He did everything correctly and efficiently with minimal drama. History essentially forgot him almost immediately. Because he returned without disaster, controversy, or a compelling story, his achievement was overshadowed by more dramatic explorers who found considerably less. Being competent was apparently not enough. 73. Jorge de Menezes was a Portuguese governor sailing between posts in 1526 when monsoon winds blew his ship severely off course and deposited him on the northern coast of a massive island he had never seen before. He had accidentally become the first European to reach New Guinea. He was not particularly excited about this. He stopped only because he needed to wait out the monsoon season, found the island hot, uncomfortable, and unwelcoming, named it Papua, using a Malay word meaning frizzy-haired, and left as quickly as the weather allowed. One of the great geographical discoveries of the era was treated as an inconvenient weather delay. 74. Luis Valles de Torres sailed through the strait between Australia and New Guinea in 1606, proving they were 2 completely separate landmasses and making one of the most significant geographical discoveries of the age of exploration. His report was filed with Spanish colonial authorities who immediately classified it as a state secret to prevent rival nations from using the information. The report sat hidden for 150 years. No other navigator could benefit from Torres's discovery during that entire period. The strait was eventually named after him, but the discovery itself had been deliberately locked away and made useless for generations. 75. Abel Tasman was sent by the Dutch East India Company in 1642 to explore the southern Pacific and find commercially valuable new territories. He had an extraordinarily eventful voyage. He sailed completely around Australia without ever actually seeing Australia. He discovered Tasmania, became the first European to sight New Zealand, and made first European contact with Fiji. He returned to Batavia, having encountered genuinely significant new lands across the Pacific. The Dutch East India Company reviewed his findings and concluded that none of the territories he had found contained anything worth trading or colonizing. They considered the entire expedition a commercial disappointment. 76. Willem Janszoon sailed north from Batavia in 1606 and landed on the Cape York Peninsula of Australia, becoming the first European to set foot on the Australian continent. He charted a stretch of the northern coastline and made contact with Aboriginal people, during which several of his crew were killed in skirmishes. Janszoon concluded the land was barren, dangerous, and completely without commercial value. He sailed away and filed his report. Nobody updated the maps properly for decades afterward. The continent, that would eventually become one of the most significant British colonial territories in history, was dismissed as worthless on its very first European visit. 77. Jacob Roggeveen discovered Easter Island on Easter Sunday in 1722, which gave him an easy name for it. He spent 1 week observing the enormous mysterious stone statues standing across the island and interacting with the local population. During a tense misunderstanding on the beach, his crew opened fire and killed approximately a dozen islanders. Roggeveen sailed away after his 1-week visit. When he returned to Amsterdam, his employers, the Dutch East India Company, were furious not about the violence but because he had sailed into territory they had not authorized him to enter. They fined him and confiscated his ships for the unauthorized detour. 78. Jean-François Marie de Surville was a French navigator sailing through the Pacific in 1769 searching for a rumored wealthy continent in the Southern Ocean. He passed very close to New Zealand at almost exactly the same time that James Cook was there on his first Pacific voyage. The two ships came within miles of each other in the same waters at the same moment, neither crew aware the other existed. Cook was systematically charting New Zealand with typical thoroughness. Surville was searching for a continent that did not exist. They nearly crossed paths and sailed on in different directions without ever knowing how close they had come. 79. Thomas Button was sent into Hudson Bay in 1612 specifically to find Henry Hudson after the mutiny and to continue searching for the Northwest Passage. He found neither Hudson nor the passage. He wintered on the western shore of the bay where conditions were brutal, and he lost a significant portion of his crew to cold and disease. He spent the winter naming geographical features around him, which was at least productive. When he finally sailed home, he reported that Hudson Bay was essentially a dead end, with no western outlet toward Asia. He was largely correct, which saved future expeditions some trouble even if it solved nothing. 80. Luke Fox was an English navigator sent into Hudson Bay in 1631 to find the Northwest Passage. Somewhere in the bay, he encountered another English expedition commanded by Thomas James doing exactly the same thing. The two captains met, came aboard each other's ships, and had dinner together in the middle of the Arctic while comparing notes on their respective searches. Neither had found anything useful. Fox decided the passage was not there and sailed home to England in good health. James stayed through a terrible winter, suffered greatly, found nothing, and eventually returned to write a celebrated account of his misery. 81. Thomas James deliberately sank his own ship in the shallow waters of Hudson Bay in the winter of 1631 to prevent the ice from crushing and destroying it completely, which was either brilliant improvisation or an act of desperation depending on how generously you view the situation. He and his crew survived the winter on the frozen bay, refloated the ship in spring, and sailed home having found no Northwest Passage and having nearly died multiple times in the attempt. He wrote a vivid and harrowing account of the experience that became widely read in England and is believed to have directly inspired Samuel Taylor Coleridge when he wrote the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. 82. Martin Frobisher sailed to Baffin Island in 1576, searching for the Northwest Passage, and came back with something he considered even better. He had found what appeared to be gold ore sitting right on the surface of the island. England went into a frenzy of excitement. Frobisher made 3 separate expeditions and brought back 200 tons of the glittering material, while investors poured money into the venture and national anticipation built to extraordinary levels. Experts then examined the ore carefully and identified it as iron pyrite, commonly known as fool's gold, which is completely worthless. 200 tons of worthless rock had been shipped across the Atlantic at enormous national expense. 83. Francis Drake completed a full circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580, becoming only the second person in history to do so and the first to survive the entire voyage as commander. During the journey, he sailed up the California coast and claimed the entire territory for England, naming it Nova Albion, and performing a formal ceremony of possession on behalf of Queen Elizabeth. England did absolutely nothing with this claim afterward. Spain continued controlling California for the next 200 years without any meaningful English challenge. Drake's California claims sat on paper, achieving nothing while England focused its attention elsewhere entirely. 84. Thomas Cavendish successfully circumnavigated the globe in 1588, becoming the third person in history to complete the feat, which was a genuine achievement worth celebrating. He attempted a second circumnavigation in 1591, and it went catastrophically wrong from the beginning. His ships were scattered by severe storms, supplies ran low, men began dying, and the expedition fell apart entirely. Cavendish died somewhere in the South Atlantic on the return voyage, sick, broke, and furious. He spent his final days writing a letter bitterly blaming his crew for every failure of the expedition. The letter survives. It is not a gracious document. 85. George Shelvocke was an English privateer rounding Cape Horn in 1719 when one of his crewmen, a man named Simon Hatley, spotted an albatross following the ship during a stretch of terrible weather. Hatley decided the bird was an omen of bad luck and shot it. The ship then experienced months of continued misfortune, storms, and disasters that the crew attributed directly to killing the bird. The incident was recorded in Shelvocke's published account of the voyage and was later read by William Wordsworth, who mentioned it to his friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge used it as the central event of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. 86. William Dampier led an English expedition into the Pacific in 1703, and his leadership was so chaotic, his judgment so poor, and his management of the crew so terrible that the men reached a breaking point during the voyage. They decided the most effective solution was to maroon one of their own members on a deserted island, rather than continue sailing with him under Dampier's command. The marooned sailor was Alexander Selkirk, who survived alone on the island for over 4 years. His story of solitary survival eventually reached England, captured the public imagination, and directly inspired Daniel Defoe when he wrote Robinson Crusoe. 87. Alexander Selkirk was the sailor left behind on the island of Mas a Tierra in the South Pacific in 1704 after demanding to be put ashore rather than continue sailing on what he considered a dangerously unseaworthy vessel. He was correct about the ship, which later sank. Selkirk survived completely alone on the island for 4 years and 4 months, building shelters, hunting goats, and keeping himself sane through remarkable resourcefulness. When a rescue ship finally arrived in 1709 and offered to take him home, Selkirk was initially reluctant to leave. He had apparently made a reasonable peace with the situation. 88. James Bruce traveled to Ethiopia in 1770 and became the first European to reach the source of the Blue Nile, which was a significant geographical achievement that had eluded explorers for generations. He returned to Britain with detailed accounts of Ethiopian customs, food, ceremonies, and culture that were vivid and specific. British society found his accounts completely unbelievable and publicly mocked him for years. Audiences laughed at his descriptions of Ethiopian dining customs. Critics called him a fantasist and a liar. He was telling the truth about everything. His vindication came slowly, and he spent years defending accurate observations that polite British society simply refused to accept. 89. Hugh Clapperton made 2 major expeditions into West Africa in the 1820s with the specific goal of solving 2 connected geographical mysteries, finding the source of the Niger River and locating its mouth. He died in Nigeria in 1827 during his second expedition without answering either question. The answers were found on a third expedition led not by any celebrated European explorer, but by Richard Lander, who had served as Clapperton's personal servant on the previous journeys. Lander followed the Niger to its mouth in 1830, and solved both questions his employer had spent 2 expeditions and his life trying to answer. 90. Johann Ludwig Burckhardt was a Swiss explorer who disguised himself as a Muslim pilgrim in 1812 and traveled through the Middle East gathering geographical information for the African Association in London. In the mountains of Jordan, he was led by a local guide to a hidden ancient city carved entirely into rose-red sandstone cliffs. He had rediscovered Petra, one of the great lost cities of the ancient world, which had been unknown to Western scholars for centuries. Burckhardt documented the discovery carefully and planned to publish his findings. He died of dysentery in Cairo in 1817 at age 32, before he could publish almost any of his work. 91. Sven Hedin was a Swedish explorer who decided in 1895 to cross the Taklamakan Desert in Central Asia, one of the most hostile and waterless environments on Earth. He set out with dramatically insufficient water supplies for the crossing, which experienced desert travelers would have immediately identified as a fatal mistake. 3 of his 4 servants died from dehydration during the crossing. Hedin himself survived by crawling on his hands and knees across the sand until he found a dried riverbed and dug down into it until he reached water. He described the entire experience afterward as one of his greatest adventures. He went back to Central Asia multiple times after that. 92. Karsten Borchgrevink led the first expedition to deliberately overwinter on the Antarctic continent in 1899, which was a historic achievement requiring genuine courage and meticulous preparation. He and his team survived the long polar winter in complete isolation and returned with valuable scientific observations about Antarctic conditions. The British geographical establishment largely ignored him. The Royal Geographical Society, which considered itself the supreme authority on polar exploration, resented the fact that a Norwegian Australian had accomplished something significant without their involvement or approval. Borchgrevink spent years being dismissed by the institution that should have celebrated him, largely because he had not asked their permission first. 93. Adrien de Gerlache led a Belgian Antarctic expedition in 1897 that made history in the worst possible way. His ship, the Belgica, became trapped in Antarctic sea ice in March and could not break free before winter set in completely. De Gerlache had not planned to overwinter in Antarctica. Nobody on board had prepared mentally or physically for 13 months trapped in the ice through a polar winter with no sunlight for weeks at a time. The crew began suffering severe psychological deterioration in the prolonged darkness. Several men had complete mental breakdowns. The ship finally broke free in March 1899. It was the first expedition to accidentally winter in Antarctic waters. 94. Douglas Mawson set out on a 3-man sledging journey across Antarctica in 1912 and returned alone, under circumstances so extreme they barely seemed survivable. One companion fell into a crevasse, taking most of the food supply with him. The second companion died shortly after, likely from vitamin A poisoning caused by eating the livers of their sled dogs, which concentrate toxic levels of the vitamin. Mawson continued alone across 100 miles of Antarctic ice, his skin peeling off in sheets from the same poisoning, his body failing, navigating back to base camp where the relief ship had already departed. He made it back by hours. 95. Apsley Cherry Garrard made what he later called the worst journey in the world during the Antarctic winter of 1911. He and 2 companions traveled in complete darkness at temperatures reaching -60 degrees Celsius, specifically to collect emperor penguin eggs, which scientists believed might reveal important clues about the evolution of birds. The journey nearly killed all 3 of them. Their tent blew away in a blizzard. Their teeth cracked from the cold. They eventually returned to base with 3 eggs. Cherry Garrard later delivered the eggs to the Natural History Museum in London. The museum staff received them with profound indifference and almost did not bother examining them. 96. Edward Wilson was a doctor and naturalist on Robert Falcon Scott's fatal South Pole expedition of 1911 and one of the 3 men who had also made the winter penguin egg journey the previous year. He reached the South Pole with Scott in January 1912, only to find that Roald Amundsen had beaten them there by 33 days. Wilson died with Scott and the rest of the polar party on the return journey, trapped in their tent by a blizzard just 11 miles from a supply depot. Among his final acts was writing letters of comfort and condolence to the families of the other dying men around him. 97. Otto Nordenskjöld led a Swedish Antarctic expedition in 1901 that was supposed to last 1 year and return on schedule. The relief ship sent to collect him the following year became trapped in ice and sank before reaching him. A second rescue attempt also failed to get through. Nordenskjöld and his team spent 2 full years stranded on the Antarctic Peninsula with no communication and no way home, completely unaware whether anyone was still looking for them. They were eventually spotted and rescued by an Argentine naval vessel that happened to be in the area essentially by chance. The entire rescue operation was an accident. 98. Charles Hall was an American Arctic explorer who died in 1871 aboard his ship during an expedition to reach the North Pole under circumstances that seemed suspicious to some of his crew at the time. He had fallen suddenly and severely ill shortly after returning from a sledge journey and accused certain crew members of poisoning him before losing consciousness. He died 2 weeks later. Nearly a century afterward, his body was exhumed from the Arctic permafrost, where it had been buried and subjected to forensic analysis. Elevated levels of arsenic were found concentrated in his hair and fingernails in patterns consistent with poisoning during the final 2 weeks of his life. 99. John Davis made 3 significant voyages into the Arctic during the 1580s, searching for the Northwest Passage, and contributed genuinely valuable geographical knowledge about the waters around Greenland and Baffin Island. He never found the passage, but his charts were useful to later explorers. His death had nothing to do with any of that. In 1605, Davis was sailing near the coast of Sumatra in Southeast Asia on a trading voyage when his ship was attacked by Japanese pirates. 9 of his crew members were killed in the attack, and Davis himself was killed during the fighting. It was an unusual end for a man who had spent his career in the Arctic. 100. Philibert de Commerson was the naturalist aboard Bougainville's circumnavigation who helped smuggle Jean Barret onto the voyage disguised as his assistant. He was a brilliant botanist who discovered and formally named hundreds of new plant and animal species during the voyage. He decided to stay behind in Mauritius when the expedition moved on, because the island's biodiversity was so extraordinary, he could not bring himself to leave. He spent years there continuing his research, accumulating thousands of specimens and observations. He died in Mauritius in 1773 before publishing virtually any of his findings. An enormous body of scientific work sat unpublished, and the world barely noticed he was gone. 101. Alexander von Humboldt climbed Chimborazo volcano in Ecuador in 1802 to a record-breaking 19,000 feet, convinced it was the highest point on Earth. He was wrong. Everest is nearly 10,000 feet taller. However, Humboldt was accidentally correct about something else entirely. Because Earth bulges at the equator, Chimborazo's summit is actually the farthest point from Earth's center on the entire planet. He got the wrong answer to the right question and stumbled into a correct fact he was not even looking for. 102. Meriwether Lewis brought his Newfoundland dog Seaman on the entire Lewis and Clark expedition across America and back, which covered thousands of miles of completely uncharted wilderness. Seaman was stolen by a group of Native Americans at one point during the journey and was returned shortly after when Lewis sent an armed party to retrieve him. Seaman was also attacked and seriously wounded by a wild beaver during the expedition. He survived both incidents and completed the full transcontinental journey, making him arguably the most well-traveled dog in American history at that point. 103. Charles Sturt led an expedition into the Australian interior in 1844, searching for a mythical inland sea at the center of the continent. He found one of the most brutal deserts on Earth instead. Temperatures reached 69 degrees Celsius in the shade. The heat was so extreme that Sturt's hair stopped growing completely, and his fingernails split apart from the conditions. He spent months trapped at a waterhole waiting for rain before finally retreating. The inland sea did not exist. The center of Australia was simply a furnace that nearly killed everyone who looked for it. 104. Ludwig Leichhardt attempted to cross Australia from east to west in 1848 with a party of 7 men and simply vanished. No bodies were ever recovered. No equipment was conclusively identified. No survivors emerged with any explanation. Search expeditions found nothing definitive. Theories have ranged from attack to starvation to simply becoming hopelessly lost in the desert. Over 170 years later, the disappearance of Leichhardt and his entire party remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of exploration history. 7 people walked into the Australian interior, and the continent swallowed them completely without leaving a single answer behind. 105. Edward John Eyre completed the first crossing of the Australian Nullarbor Plain from east to west in 1841, one of the most hostile desert environments on Earth. Midway through the journey, 2 of his companions murdered the expedition overseer and fled into the wilderness. Eyre was left alone with one remaining companion, an Aboriginal man named Wiley, and almost no supplies. The 2 men completed the crossing together, surviving on whatever they could find. Wiley's knowledge and resilience were the primary reason either of them made it to the western coast alive, though history remembered Eyre's name on the journey far more prominently. 106. John McDouall. Stewart attempted to cross Australia from south to north 6 separate times before finally succeeding on his 6th attempt in 1862. The return journey was devastating. Stewart was suffering from scurvy, his eyesight had deteriorated so severely he was nearly blind, and his body was so broken down from the crossing that he could not walk unassisted for much of the way back. His men carried him on a stretcher across significant portions of the return route. He arrived back in Adelaide having achieved one of the great feats of Australian exploration and never fully recovered his health afterward. 107. Peter Egerton Warburton crossed the Western Australian desert from Alice Springs to the coast in 1873, completing one of the most punishing overland journeys in Australian exploration history. By the time he reached the coast, he was nearly blind. Most of his camels had died, and he required physical assistance to walk. The journey had destroyed his body completely. Warburton was 60 years old when he made this crossing. 60. An age when most men of his era were firmly retired. He completed a desert crossing that defeated younger and better supplied men and barely survived the achievement. 108. William Wills was the co-leader of the Burke and Wills expedition that crossed Australia in 1861 and became one of history's most documented disasters. Wills kept writing detailed diary entries recording the expedition's collapse around him right up until the day before he died of starvation. Food and potential rescue sat at a supply cache a short distance away that he could not access. His final entries are calm, precise, and scientific even as he was dying. He documented everything with the same methodical care until he physically could not continue writing anymore. 109. Ranulph Fiennes completed the first surface circumnavigation of Earth via both poles between 1979 and 1982, which stands as one of the great endurance achievements in exploration history. In 2003, he attempted to walk solo to the North Pole and suffered catastrophic frostbite that left several fingers blackened and dead. The surgical waiting list was too long for his patients. He went home to his garden shed, took out a saw, and amputated his own fingers himself. Doctors who examined him afterward confirmed the self-surgery, while presumably taking a moment to process what they were being told. 110. George Mallory was asked by a reporter in 1924 why he wanted to climb Mount Everest, and gave the most famous answer in exploration history: because it is there. Simple, perfect, and completely unanswerable. He died on Everest later that same year during his 3rd attempt on the summit. His frozen body was discovered in 1999 by a search expedition, still lying on the mountain above 26,000 feet, exactly where he fell. Whether he reached the summit before dying remains unknown. He is still up there. The mountain kept him. 111. Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit Earth in 1961 aboard the Soviet spacecraft Vostok, which sounds like a complete triumph until you learn the spacecraft had no reliable system for landing safely with a person inside it. The actual plan was for Gagarin to eject from the capsule at high altitude and parachute separately to the ground, while the empty capsule crashed nearby. He did exactly that. The Soviet Union concealed this detail for years because international aviation rules required pilots to land inside their aircraft to claim official flight records. The first human spaceflight involved a man jumping out of his spaceship to land. 111 explorers, all completely lost. All somehow in the history books anyway. Drop a comment telling us which one was the absolute dumbest. Like and subscribe to Dumb History and watch the next video right there on your screen because we promise it is just as gloriously stupid as this one.